Welcome to the Government Unlocked Speakers Series. Today's program was recorded at Sandwich Public Library and features co-author David Martin. In this presentation, he explores the history of Cape Cod and discusses his book, The Revolutionary War on Cape Cod and the Islands. Enjoy.
Okay. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I know the weather was not enjoyable to get here, so I really appreciate you coming out. My name is Jen Ratliff. I have the honor of serving as the Sandwich Town Archivist. I'm delighted to welcome you tonight for a very special event featuring our guest, Dr. David Martin. But before we begin, just a few brief notes to help ensure everyone's comfort and safety. Restrooms are located on this level. When you go out this door, take a right. They will be down on your left, on the down the hallway. And in case of emergency, please use the stair. There are 2 staircases available, one directly to the left as you exit this room, another past the restrooms next to the elevator. I'd like to take a moment to thank the Friends of the Sandwich Town Archives, FOSTA, for making tonight's event possible. FOSTA is a dedicated, all-volunteer 501c3 nonprofit. Since its founding in 2013, FOSTA has played a vital role in supporting the Sandwich Town Archives and the archivists through fundraising, event support, and volunteerism. Many of them are here tonight, so if you spoke into the crowd, say thank you. Looking ahead, FOSTA, alongside the Sandwich Town Archives and Sandwich Public Library, have a number of exciting events planned for this fall. Some highlights include FOSTA's annual meeting on October 22nd, which will feature guest speaker Julia Blakely, who's here with us tonight. She will share captivating insights into the life and work of Dodge McKnight, local artist. She will also highlight materials from the Sandwich Town Archives, which played a significant role in her research. Additionally, next week on October 1st, Julia will join a panel of experts at a special library event celebrating McKnight's 165th birthday. And yes, there will be cake, so we hope we'll see you there. Make sure you sign up on the library calendar. Another exciting thing that FOSTA is offering soon is a free 6-week Genealogy 101 workshop, which is led by tonight's speaker, Dr. Martin. So this is a wonderful opportunity if you're interested in your family history and local history to stay tuned. Oh, excuse me. Oh, yeah. So be sure to stay tuned for upcoming events. Check FOSTA's website, FOSTAsandwich.org, and check the library's website and event calendar, sandwichpubliclibrary.com. All right, to begin tonight, our special guest, Dr. David Martin, respected historian and genealogist who has served as president of both Cape Cod Genealogical Society and the Marston's Mills Historical Society. As chair of the Cape and Islands Historians Committee, he led the development of this new volume on Cape Cod and the Islands during the Revolutionary period. A dedicated educator, Dr. Martin also teaches genealogy courses, including our upcoming Genealogy 101 workshop that we'll hope you join us for. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Martin to the Sandwich Public Library.
Thanks very much, Jen. I appreciate the chance to be here. And this will begin a little bit of very recent history. About almost 3 years ago, a group of us amateur historians were sitting around talking about various things. And we say, well, you know, in 2026, the 250th anniversary of independence comes around. And we don't know of anything that's been recent and systematic about the coverage of the Revolutionary period of Cape Cod and the islands. Yes, there had been things written, a lot of it in the 19th century, as a matter of fact. But we said, we think there's a need for a single putting together of something that will cover the Revolutionary period in our region.
And so we began, and we ended up with 27 contributors, all co-authors, a little bit like herding cats, you might say, in the editorial process, but very enjoyable and very educational for those of us on the Historians Committee. There were 6 people on that at that time. So what we're going to look at is not just the period of the Revolutionary War, but some things that came before, because that's very important to understanding the context. And some of it you already know, so this is a review. But I'm going to start with this particular slide because we had to search quite a bit to find a well-done, accurate map in that time period of Cape Cod. You've probably seen old maps of Cape Cod where the end of the peninsula is up straight or there's distortions and so on. This one is not distorted. This was done by a British cartographer, actually a German who was working for the British government named Blaskowitz, and it was done in 1775, so it's definitely contemporary, but it's reasonably accurate. And so we said this has got to go into the book that we will pull together. So that's a story on the map. And so this next question is the big question that a lot of people ask themselves and wonder about. And there's arguments about that. And I'll give you a couple of the different arguments when we go through this. But the point is that this didn't all happen on April 19, 1775. And so the question is, well, where can we trace the roots? Well, there's a lot of people start with 1761, when our own James Otis Jr., Cape Cod, Barnstable Village, spoke out in Boston against what was known as the writs of assistance. And the writs of assistance were basically giving the British government the right to do a lot of what we would call searching of imports. And that started to really rankle the colonists. 1763, the end of the French and Indian Wars, which in England they called the 7 Years' War. Actually, it was much longer than 7 years if you trace it back. And of course, I'll talk about tea, as you can well imagine. And then right here on Cape Cod, some protesters closed the Barnstable courthouse in 1774. Again, a very important act by Cape Codders in terms of the Revolutionary period. We know about Lexington and Concord, and of course, the Cape Militia joined in the siege of Boston that followed that. And then, of course, we have the Declaration, which they celebrate, of course, next year as the 250th anniversary. Interestingly enough, George Washington also in that year, when he became the general of the army, said, you know, we need a canal on Cape Cod for military purposes. Now, that wasn't the first time. It had actually been proposed in 1627 by Miles Standish. And of course, it only took 300 years to actually build. But it is interesting that George Washington recognized the military advantage of having a canal in terms of protecting shipping and so on. I'm going to talk a lot about the HMS Somerset wreck in 78, and an interesting case, probably the only real battle fought on Cape Cod in 1779. Then we finally have the surrender in 1781 in Yorktown, where Cape Cod soldiers were present. And then it took 2 years to get the Treaty of Paris actually signed. And then, of course, the big event, the passing of the U.S. Constitution 4 years later. So that's a very quick kind of thumbnail of some things that are big events in the Revolutionary period and a couple of sprinklings of local history. Then I think we need to ask the question and come back to the point of how did it all start? Well, what we've done is we've divided this book into 4 sections. The period 1761 to 1774, 1774 to mid-1776, obviously July 4th. Then from July 4th of 76 to the Peace Treaty, and then a final section on biographical descriptions of 10 key individuals on the Cape Cod Islands who played an important role that is often neglected. And I want to draw our attention to John Adams here. As you know, John Adams was our second president and Thomas Jefferson was the third, and they were very much closely allied in the writing of the Declaration. Then they became bitter political enemies. But when Jefferson's term was up and the War of 1812 had occurred, they patched up their differences, and for the rest of their lives, they carried on a wonderful correspondence between Quincy, and Virginia. And then letters went back and forth by horseback, and these two giants of our American history were exchanging ideas about what it was all about, what it really meant. And this quote here, and by the way, we have all the John Adams papers at Harvard, and historians are just loving the opportunity to analyze them. But in 1815, in writing to Jefferson and thinking about the Revolution itself, he said, and I'm just going to read this, he says, "What do we mean by the Revolutionary War? The war was no part of the Revolution," he says, "but only a consequence of it." And that was a kind of a new idea for many of us who were starting to study of it. He said, "The revolution was in the minds of the people, and that was an effort from 1760 to 1775 before a drop of blood was shed at Lexington. It was a people's revolution involving farmers, tradesmen, craftsmen, we could add fishermen, the middling classes." So that's John Adams' take on the meaning of the revolution and how it started. You could disagree with that, but I always find that going to a scholarly individual as a source is something that we can do. So many people will say, you know, the revolution didn't really have to happen if Parliament had played their cards a little differently. But let's be fair about it. What was the case in the early 1760s? The French and Indian Wars had just ended successfully for Britain. George Washington got his practice at being an army officer in fighting for the British against the French and Indians. When that had been secured for England, then Parliament realized they had run up a big debt. And so the next question is, when a governmental body finds that the country is in debt, you look around for sources of income. And they said, aha, the colonies are a fertile source of revenue. And so they began to exert and assert some taxes. And the rest of the decade is, and beyond, is a history of Parliament adding this tax and taking it away and adding something worse and so on. And we think that perhaps we can't roll history back, but if Parliament had had a different way of approaching this, then we might be part of, like, Canada today. But that's only speculation. Some people say that wouldn't be all bad. But in any case, I've already mentioned the writs of assistance. So I'd like to run through this sort of catalog of what led to the revolution on a larger scale, which of course included Cape Cod and the islands. So search warrants on navigation and trade was something that really got James Otis Jr. really riled up. And I'll talk about the Otis family because we should be very proud of them as Cape Codders, because they were key in the revolution. Of course, then the first act began, and that was the Sugar Act. And 1764, you can guess what that tax was on. And then the Stamp Act really began to get under the skin of the colonists. And the Stamp Act was putting a tax on all forms of paper. Paper was very important and very hard to get. You had any kind of a mortgage or a deed or any kind of a transaction that was on paper had to have a stamp, and you had to pay the Parliament for the stamp, or pay the British government. So there was a big hue and cry about that. Well, then a year later, Parliament says, okay, we'll cancel the Stamp Act, but we're going to do what's called the Declaratory Act. And that said, taxation in the colonies is now the very same as it is in Britain. And that began to bother a lot of colonists. Then only a year later, a parliamentarian named Townsend added an act that got passed with no problem, taxes on china, glass, lead, paper again, and tea. That's a big one because, of course, everyone loved their tea. In 1770, we have the Boston Massacre, and some people say that, well, perhaps the Patriots fired first, we don't know for sure, but it was a very negative event that kind of began to make people really solidify their feelings against the mother country. And in that same year, this Parliament said, okay, we'll repeal the Townshend Act except for the tax on tea. We're going to keep the tax on tea. Then we have, a couple of years later, the beginning of what was called committees of correspondence. And the first one in the colonies was in Boston. A committee of correspondence was basically a grievance committee that started to list their grievances against the Crown. And then, in following that example, other colonies formed their own committees of correspondence. So this is where Boston and Massachusetts began to have an influence on a larger scale. The Tea Act was reinforced in '73, and of course, that same year was the Boston Tea Party, where a group of colonists dressed as Indians raided and dumped a whole lot of tea into Boston Harbor. And I'll come back to that because Cape Cod played an interesting indirect role in that. In '74, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, and the colonists called that the Intolerable Acts. And you can see why, because now they're saying the Crown appoints the governors. You all in the colonists don't appoint your own governors anymore. So obviously cutting back on independence. And then it also said, we're going to close the port of Boston because you people are too much trouble. And by the way, when we station troops, you have to quarter them. And that really bothered a lot of people. Think of you, if you were a colonist in the Boston area and you were told by the main government, which is 3,000 miles away, that you had to put up some soldiers in your house. You didn't have any choice about that. And so the cumulative effect of all of these things, of course, led to an unmistakable urge to become independent. Right after the April 1775 Lexington and Concord battle, Parliament passed another act because the independence hadn't been declared yet, and it was called the Prohibitory Act. And that said, no more trade among your fellow colonies. Again, trying to narrow the whole scope, and that was directly in response to that. Now, we can leave this timeline aside, but I'm going to raise the question again about, well, where did it all begin? Was it 1761? Some historians say, no, it really was 1620 with the Mayflower Compact. That was a world's first document of people who had left a mother country and declaring themselves as a self-governing body. Other people, historians say, well, the circumstances were separate and they weren't really a country yet, and so on. I don't know where you think you fall on that spectrum, but the fact of the matter is that it is possible to say, if you go back to the Mayflower Compact, that in a sense was a kind of a start of wanting to be ourselves. So anyway, these things are always open to speculation. Well, let's come back closer to home here and look at our friends in the Otis family. We have Colonel James Otis Sr., who was the judge in the Barnstable court, and then James Otis Jr., whom I've already mentioned, and his sister, Mercy Otis, who married Dr. James Warren. And Mercy is an important figure. She was one of very few women who were well educated because women were not permitted to have an education beyond the teenage years in that time period. She became very erudite, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And John Adams talks again in 1818 to Thomas Jefferson about James Otis Jr. He says, I've never known a man whose love of country was more ardent or severe, never one whose services for any 10 years of his life were so important and essential to the cause of this country as those of Mr. Otis. And now notice what he says, between 1760 and 1770. Why does he stop at 1770? This is the sad story. James Otis Jr. was what you might call today a firebrand. And he got into a really serious, I won't say brawl, but a really serious argument in a pub in Boston in about 1770. And a loyalist struck him on the head with his cane. And he was never right thereafter. And he went into a mental decline. Of course, he had wonderfully served the cause of independence by all of his writings and speechifying, which was apparently very admirable. I would love to have been able to hear him rousing a crowd. But his useful story ends at that point. He passed away through a bolt of lightning. He had said that he wanted to die by lightning. And in 1783, he deliberately stood in the doorway of a house during a thunderstorm and was struck and killed by lightning. So I guess you could say, what a way to go. But this is close to home. This is our Barnstable Otis family that we can be very much proud of. And as you know, there are statues to James Jr. and Mercy outside the Barnstable Courthouse in Route 6A in Barnstable Village. Here he is. There's a painting of him railing against the writs of assistance, the search warrants. And John Adams says the American independence was then and there born, and he's saying that was 1761. So as a historian, John Adams says, well, let's really mark that date as sort of the beginning. This is Mercy's statue outside of the Barnstable Courthouse, and this is an example of one of the very learned tracts that she wrote. This one is looking back at the American Revolution, and it is, of course, been published and was widely read at the time. Another feature of the Revolutionary period was the erecting of liberty poles, and right here in Sandwich, there was a liberty pole, along with one in Yarmouth and one in the Vineyard, and probably elsewhere. And a liberty pole was a pole that had a rebel flag, you could say, flying from it, and it was a rallying point for getting people in favor of breaking away from the mother country. And in fact, this next slide shows the people on the Vineyard in front of their liberty pole, and they're trying to prevent the British from removing the pole because it was, as I say, a rallying point. Then we have, as I mentioned before, the question of the Tea Party and Cape Cod's involvement in it. And Cape Cod did have a role in this sense. There were 4 tea ships that set out from England. Only 3 made it to Boston. The 4th ship, the William, wrecked on our friend the Shoals off of Truro in Provincetown. And I say friend because in a way that protected us, as you'll see with another shipwreck in a few minutes. But in any case, now we've got a dilemma. Here's these colonials who are living in the Provincetown, Truro area, and they've suddenly got all this tea because they managed to, of course, rescue a lot of it. It floated because it was in the wooden bales. What were they going to do? Well, let's see. They could drink it, or they could sell it, or they could destroy it, or they could return it to the British. Well, guess what? All 4 things happened in different ways. And so they had quite a dilemma about what are we going to do. But in any case, that's a pretty good painting showing them retrieving the tea from the ship William that, of course, had foundered and, of course, ultimately sank. So that's our Cape Cod connection indirectly with the Tea Act and the Tea Party, although there were some people from the Cape who were at the Tea Party. We don't know that there were any actual participants. Then there's the story of Nantucket. Completely different. We have to remember that on Nantucket, there was a very thriving whaling industry that was being operated by Quaker merchants. First of all, Quakers were against war in any case. They were always in pro-peace. But secondly, they were doing just fine, selling whaling oil to England and getting flour in return, which they needed in an island community. And so they were not particularly interested in breaking away at all. It was a divided island. And in fact, it remained divided for the period throughout the war. And we know that after the war was over, Nantucket flirted with the idea of becoming a separate country because they saw themselves as very different from the mainland. So that's a very different story compared to Martha's Vineyard, which is our other island. And this particular slide shows not only Martha's Vineyard, but also the Elizabeth Islands, which plays an important role in a part of this presentation that I'm going to share with you in a few minutes. So we have the Elizabeth Islands chain that go out from Woods Hole to the southwest, and I've circled some things that I'll come back to. The big British ship, 1775, known as the Falkland, stopped at Noshawn Island. And Noshawn Island is the biggest of the Elizabeth Islands. And the British warships hid out in the Elizabeth Islands so they could attack shipping and particularly conduct raids on the Vineyard and particularly on Falmouth. Why? Because invading armies always have to have a source of food. And so they were raiding farms and killing and slaughtering cattle for meat, and they were stealing the vegetables and fruit from the farmers in the area, which we'll talk more about a little bit. So let's go to the second period, 1774 to mid-1776. Patriots closed the Barnstable court, and I'll say more about that. The Loyalists had a number of allies. In fact, Barnstable was the only town that voted no for independence at first, on the first vote. Again, why would that be? Well, there were some pretty wealthy merchants who were doing just fine, thank you, dealing with England. They did say vote yes after that. In this period, of course, we have Lexington and Concord. And Harwich, of all the towns of the Cape Cod, was the first to vote for independence. I'm kind of interested to know more detail about that, and I'm going to be talking to a Harwich group on the weekend, so I want to inquire about that. What happened was that each of the colonies' legislative bodies voted about going independent, but in Massachusetts they said, you know, even though we voted for it, I think we better consult the towns anyway. And so they did that, and that's when they were able to count which towns were for it and which ones were against. The Loyalists, mentioned there in the second bullet, is something that I want to just comment on. Some of the Patriots were what you might call real rabble-rousers, and they were not particularly nice people. And one of the things they did was they found a Loyalist woman in Barnstable Village, Abby Freeman, and they tarred and feathered her and then rode her on a rail through the village. I don't know if you've thought about being tarred and feathered, but pine tar, when it's hot and put on the body, is very painful, but also it's the public shame that went with it. So we try to be fair about that. There were misbehaviors on both sides here in some cases. I'm going to talk about the Marshfield incident in just a few minutes. And this is the time period when the Cape Militia joined Washington's army, in some cases at Boston. And it's the time when the cannons, 59 cannons from Fort Ticonderoga in this time period, 1775, were dragged on sledges in the wintertime all the way across Massachusetts, drawn by oxen, and they were mounted on Dorchester Heights, pointing down toward the British. Guess what happened? The British said, I think we're going to go home. And so you know that March 17th is not only St. Patrick's Day, but it's Evacuation Day, and that's celebrated in 1776 when the British said, we're leaving. So that's kind of an important event for us in Massachusetts. Well, here's the Barnstable Courthouse, and of course you've seen this now. That's where Tales of Cape Cod holds their weekly lectures through the fall, spring, and summer. And this is something where the James Otis Sr. was a judge. And people went to him in 1774 and said, you know, this represents the crown. We like you, Mr. Otis, but we're going to close the court. And he at first was concerned, and then he said, I will step aside. And they closed the Barnstable Courthouse, which was a big symbolic event because the Barnstable Court, of course, was an arm of the crown. And this is the same time period when they tarred and feathered poor Abby Freeman. So April 1775 is the, of course, well-known Battle of Lexington and Concord. What was the involvement of Cape Cod in that? There was an indirect involvement that's kind of interesting. At the time, prior to the battle, there was a British garrison that was stationed in Marshfield to keep an eye on things. And so the militia had an encampment not too far from the garrison to keep an eye on the British. So then the word came down that there was going to be something brewing in Lexington, and that the event that was about to happen would draw away the militia that were guarding the Marshfield garrison, because they would be needed in Lexington. So the word came that they had left for Lexington, and the Cape militia said, well, we've got to replace them because we couldn't continue to watch that British garrison. So a group of Cape Cod militia marched and got all the way to Sandwich on their way to Marshfield. And then they heard from a horseback rider that you don't need to go. The British have left too. So they turned around and went home. So that's our indirect connection with Lexington and Concord. They were ready to hold the fort if needed. Well, then we have, and I'm proud to say that in this book, there are two populations that have not had sufficient space in the writings about this period for the Cape and Islands. One of them is the role of Wampanoag and indigenous people, and the other is African Americans. And so in our book, there is research that is brand new that helps to really explain the significance and the degree of participation by the Wampanoag, as well as African Americans who were, in many cases, freed slaves. So, of course, the Wampanoag are in southeastern Mass and in the Mashpee and Martha's Vineyard as well, and they stepped up. And why would you think that the highest percentage of people stepping up for the Continental Army would be people from Mashpee? Any guess about that? Yes?
It was almost 100% Wampanoag people living there.
Well, that's part of it, but not only. Why would the Wampanoags have signed up for a Continental Army when there's a bunch of white people? Yeah. Well, partly, yes. They saw it as a way of possibly getting some of their land back that had been taken from them. Now, unfortunately for them, it didn't work out that way. But so the highest percentage of people who stepped up, not the highest number, but the highest percentage, was very definitely from the town of Mashpee. I think that's an interesting fact that we have discovered here. We've documented at least 24 African Americans who were part of the militia. 6 of them were sailing on privateers. I haven't talked about privateering yet, and we're still doing research on this. One of our authors is formerly a retired CIA investigator, and he has done some wonderful digging, because people who work for the CIA really know how to dig out information, and he's had to work very hard with very few documentations. So in any case, that is something that we're particularly pleased about. Well, what about the Vineyard? Well, there were raids conducted by the British, as I said, for food and cattle and meat and so on. But Martha's Vineyard also participated in privateering. And as you know, a privateer is what you might call a legalized pirate ship. And that has to have what's called a letter of marque from your governmental body that legalizes your acting on behalf of the government for raiding and killing or stealing from an enemy ship. And so there's a lot of privateering going on around the Vineyard because, of course, it's an island and is tied to seafaring. Well, in the third period, of course, we have Valley Forge, and there were Cape Cod people at Valley Forge suffering through that absolutely terrible winter of 77. The privateers are very active on both sides of the war. And this is when Washington said, let's do a survey for a possible canal. Admiral Gray raids the Vineyard in 78, and that really caused some interesting results. And what I'm going to talk about now is the wreck of the Somerset. So in this third and final period, we have lots going on, of course. This is a painting of privateers in action, and that happens to be from 1781. It shows them firing on a British ship, and we have the Cape soldiers enduring Valley Forge. Valley Forge, of course, was the place where the American Army actually really solidified, because they brought in Baron von Steuben from Germany, and he really straightened out and got people to know how to follow orders and mark and step and a whole lot of other very important basics. So it wasn't all tragic. And then we have smallpox, and this is, of course, not unique to Cape Cod and the islands, but at that time, smallpox was rampant, but there had been some early experimentation with inoculation. Now, this isn't a very pleasant topic, but I have to tell you, if you don't know already, the first methods of immunization for smallpox. They would take the scab of someone who is recovering from smallpox, healing, and they would open the part of the arm of a person they wanted to immunize and put the scab onto that opening, and that would give just enough of a smallpox germ to immunize the person. George Washington, to his credit, realized that he had to do something about his army. If he hadn't, probably many more of his army would have been killed by smallpox than by British guns. And so that isn't that an interesting example of a medical dimension right in the midst of war. Well, this is an interesting wreck. If you remember, in 7th grade English, you probably read, with your teacher's help, Longfellow's poem about the midnight ride of Paul Revere. And in about the 8th verse, Longfellow talks about the shadow of the Somerset looming over the river as Paul Revere was trying to negotiate by rowboat going across the river to the other side to begin his horseback ride. And that basically he went right under the bows of the Somerset. And of course, that's in 1775. This is a very large ship that continued to play a role in the war, transporting many, not only goods, but also people. In August of 78, it wrecked again off of Provincetown. This time, not many people drowned. They took 450 prisoners off of that ship. A small group of patriots rounded them up and marched them all the way from Truro to Boston. And it took, I think, well over a week. Now, when they got to Boston, there was not 450 anymore. There was about 300 and some. Some had died, some had kind of drifted off, and I'm just wondering if there's anybody here tonight who thinks they might be a descendant of a Somerset prisoner of war who decided to not go to Boston. Nobody. I really would love to know that. In any case, they were rounded up and brought to Boston, and they were later used as prisoner exchanges with the British for exchanges of prisoners of war on both sides. The interesting thing about it is that the Somerset's still with us. And it reappears on the sands of the Cape Cod National Seashore from time to time. This is one of its appearances in the early part of the 20th century, and you can still see the bones of it. And then the ocean covers it over, and then it comes. I think the last time it appeared was about 2007. So it's still there, and the ocean uncovers part of it. The National Seashore is very particular about this. You are not allowed to take any samples with your pocket knife. It's strictly to look at only when it reappears. But it's there. And then we have a connection with the Somerset in a kind of an unexpected way. We know that salt was terribly important in this time period because there wasn't refrigeration. That's how you preserved food. And the British knew that, and so they kind of basically killed the salt industry. Salt industry was based on digging out what you might call large pans of dirt that is each one about the size of this room, and pumping seawater into it, and then the seawater evaporates, and what's left is salt. And you usually build a shelter over it to protect it from rain, which is, you don't want fresh water getting in there. Well, they basically destroyed the Cape Cod salt industry. But good old John Sears of Dennis said, there's a bilge pump in the Somerset. Let's get the bilge pump, and we'll use it to pump water again into some newly constructed pans, and that's exactly what he did. And so, in a way, that was another benefit of the shipwreck that the British never even thought about, and the salt industry was restarted. Here's a picture, a more modern picture in Sessoit Harbor, but you can see that they're raking the water and trying to facilitate the evaporation process. What you see in the upper left-hand corner picture is the roof that they would push out over when the rain was coming. So the salt industry was reborn in that sense, thanks to the wreck of the Somerset. And then the last thing I want to share with you is the only real, what you would call, battle that was fought on Cape Cod soil. When you research on the internet the Battle of Falmouth, Massachusetts, you get not one but two entries. I was kind of surprised. You get one entry for 1775 and then what's 1779. I said, well, wait a minute. I'm talking about the 1779 one. What's this 1775 Battle of Falmouth, Massachusetts? And then I realized Massachusetts and Maine were part of the same state until 1820, all right? So there was a Battle of Falmouth, Massachusetts, which was really in a suburb of Portland, Maine, called Falmouth. And that was the first Battle of Falmouth. It was not terribly significant from a military point of view, but the one in Falmouth, Massachusetts, Cape Cod was, I think, very interesting. So I'd like to sketch the context of this for you. As I said before, the British were conducting raids, in particular Falmouth, very vulnerable because it's right at the edge of the peninsula, slaughtering cattle for food, stealing other food or vegetables and so on, and generally harassing the citizens. And so Colonel Dimmock, who was an officer in the militia that was right in that area, said, well, we're going to get back. And so they did some counter raids on the British. And that really made the British really bad, really upset. And so they said, we're going to get them. Here's a painting that's in the Woods Hole Library that shows the British sailors and some boats. You can't see their main ships, and they're slaughtering cattle. If you read the descriptions of it that were written in the 19th century, that said they knocked the cattle on the head and then cut them up. So that's part of the context. This is Tarpaulin Cove on North Shore Island. That is a major cove that faces the southwest. Anybody know Tarpaulin Cove? Okay, so if you must be a sailor, right? Oh, okay, very good. Well, yeah, right. And you're familiar with it from a sailor point of view? Yeah. I spent a night there on a sailboat in 1972, and it was a rough night because there's nothing to keep the southwest wind out of there. But in any case, it's a wonderful sheltered area, and there are 10 British ships stationed there waiting for the next orders. So what happened? Well, you've all heard the phrase, loose lips sink ships, and this is a good example of it. On the evening of April 2nd, a plan had been made to burn Falmouth tomorrow, April 3rd. And on Pasque Island, which is next door to Norshon, was a Tory or loyalist person who was entertaining some British officers from the British ships at his home on that night of April 2nd. And he overheard them talking about this. And even though he was a loyalist, he said, those poor people of Falmouth are defenseless. They've got to be warned. And so what he did was he sent his son, his 9-year-old son, to row at night in a rowboat 4 miles without a GPS and without a compass and without a light, 4 miles from Pasque to Woods Hole, to rouse the militia, to get them up and ready to defend Falmouth because the British are coming. And this young boy did this successfully, and he got the word out, and he got it to the heads of the militia. And so under the cover of night, the militia formed, and what happened. There's a children's book that's written about Asa Slocum. I happen to have it here. And there's an artist's conception of what it was like rowing at night and so on. That's the cover illustration. And of course, on the right-hand side, you see the Elizabeth Islands again. So here's Tarpaulin Cove in Norshon. Here's Pasque, where the Tory entertainer was. And so this son had to row all the way to Woods Hole, alone. It's a pretty amazing story, actually.
And the waters around Woods Hole and the tourists.
Terrible. Yes.
Unbelievable. All those holes are bad.
Absolutely. He must have been lucky that maybe he was at a middle tide that may have helped, but I don't know that. But you're absolutely right. So he succeeded. They got the militia together. 220 militia responded. They had built sometime before on what's called Surf Drive, if you're familiar with that in Falmouth. It overlooks Vineyard Sound. They had taken the sand at that long, long beach, and they had made entrenchments so that they made mounds of sand that were about this high, just big enough to crouch behind and hide. And so they went under the cover of night and they reinforced those. And Then the militia got ready and crouched behind them with their muskets at the ready. This is a painting that's in the Falmouth Historical Society, and it shows the British ships in the background, and it shows that these boats of what you might call British Marines were getting ready to attack. So the Falmouth militia are hidden, and this is another painting that's in the Falmouth Town Hall that shows a different perspective of the same event. Well, what happened was they waited till the critical moment when the British troops were in the water, and then the militia rose up and fired 2 volleys, because you can get off 2 shots before you have to reload with those muskets. And guess what? The British changed their mind. And in any case, one of the important things here is that the volleys actually killed 15 British and wounded 20, and so the British retreated, and then they said, okay, we're going to burn Falmouth anyway. So they started to lob cannonballs that would be the kind which then when it hits the ground it would bounce, and then it would ignite a fire in any building that it encountered. Well, it's April, and we all know from living in New England that April you've got a thaw going on. The ground is wet and soggy, and so the cannonballs went thud. They didn't bounce. And so that whole thing failed, and the British said, we're going to go back to Nonamesset, and we're going to go back to Vineyard, and we're going to go back to the Vineyard. This is not going to work. And they were going to do that to protect the loyal refugees, that is, those who are loyalists there. And so that was the story of the Battle of Falmouth, Massachusetts, the 1779 one. And I'm proud to tell you that I had an ancestor who fought in that battle. He was only 16 years old. He was a fifer. And remember that fifers at the time wasn't just playing music. They blew signals like attack or retreat and so on, just like the drummers did in 18th century warfare. And so we had a service of commemoration for his grave, which is in the old burying ground in Falmouth, if you're familiar with that. And then finally we have the surrender at Yorktown. And then the treaty in '83, a very slow economic recovery everywhere, including Cape Cod and the islands. A lot of loyalists said, we're going to Canada. And they did. Finally, the Constitution gets written and ratified, and then the War of 1812 starts. And we have kind of a all over again kind of situation. In any case, that is what I wanted to share with you. I'll be very glad to answer questions. If you're interested in purchasing the book, it's $25, either cash or a check made out to MMHS, which is the Marston Mills Historical Society. But I would be very glad to entertain comments and questions. Yes?
When you mentioned about the no trade among the colonies,
Yes.
was it also between the colonies?
Yes.
The state to state could not trade with one another?
That's right, yes. That's exactly what I meant, that different colonies of the 13 original ones were clearly trading because they had different things that they had. So the southern ones had agricultural products, and there were some technical things.
Between each other, not just two outside.
No, only within the group, yeah. And so that was quite a blow. Yes?
Did you were saying something about inoculation or the first case? I heard somewhere in the past that the Adams family, John As family, I believe it was like some of the first, like whoever were inoculated.
I hadn't heard that, but I'm not surprised. That's very, very possible, because of course it was in the very same time period, and John Adams was a very intelligent man who was very up to date with the times. So that would be very possible, I think. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I can check that out. Other comments? Yes.
I believe it was Abigail Adams who wrote to Washington, and she had her own children inoculated, and she actually is, I believe this person is said to Washington Moody to.
Oh, really? Okay.
She and Mercy Otis Warren had their own correspondence together. They were very close
Yes.
friends.
That's a wonderful correspondence too.
We have letters that are up. Yeah. So
It's the equal of the Adams and Jefferson ones, and different. Yeah. Thank you very much for that. That's good. Yeah. Other thoughts or questions? Yes.
Comment. I don't know if you guys saw this book, but anybody was a sandwich. There's a book here by a guy named Percival. I lived at Farmers Mill Road by Mark Pond, and John Benjamin lived there, let's say during this period. And
Yes.
he wrote his daily journal of him marching to Falmouth with his brother. Well, I gotta look up, see if that was the incident that particular year, but he did march all the way 15 miles and back when they were called by the militia. And I think with that, what you just illustrated, he may have been, I did think all the way there it was over, but
Right.
they got
Well,
called.
I urge you to check that out because the militia were drawn from a local area, Sandwich, Falmouth, and right nearby. And then there were other regional militias elsewhere on the Cape. And so it would make good sense that he would have been pulled down there for that. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Right. Anything? Yes.
Now, you mentioned that there was a series in Barnstable or something about the Tales of Cape Cod.
Yes.
Is
Yes.
there some way to find out when that is?
All you need to do is use your computer to Google Tales of Cape Cod, Tales, and they have a series of Monday night lectures. And I think they start in June, and they're just about finishing now. Is that right? And every Monday night, there's a different presentation on a different aspect of Cape Cod history. And one of our co-authors gave a presentation there in August on the Otis family. So that, yes, if you're interested in history, and you clearly are, they're wonderful. I think they charge $10 or $15, and they serve a delicious dessert afterward. Strawberry shortcake. That's very well worth checking out, and they'll be doing a lot next year, of course, on the Revolution. Yeah. Yes.
And I can highly recommend Dr. Martin's genealogy course. I took it at Sturgis Library when I'm there. It's incredible. And the first you get 28K syllabus, and I'm like, this guy is best. It's so organized. And have I finished? No, it's going to be forever, but it's a way to rack your mind around all the resources. It's really quite amazing.
There's health stars available if you want to join us next month.
No, I did it, and I'm really enjoying it. Do it. It's in all the volunteers are so generous. I unlocked the NA stuff. I had open minded about researching, so I hired them.
Well, thank you for that commercial. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Anything further? Well, thank you very much for coming, and if you'd like a book, I'll just be at the table. So, thank you. Thank you.